painting you with a view to a kill. Face to face in secret places, feel the chill. Nightfall covers me, but you know the plans I'm making still oversee.
So hey guys, I'm going to settle in for a new series that I'm going to do, and this is about serial killers. Now the first one that I'm going to start off with is a Scottish serial killer, and he's pretty disgusting, pretty bad. So trigger warning: if anyone has any problem listening to anything to do with sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional harm, anything like that, please just click out of this video. This isn't going to be for you. Okay, so let's get into it. And today we're going to talk about serial killer Peter Tobin. Now, I'm not going to do what most people that make these videos do and start at the beginning of these creeps' life. To understand the case of Peter Tobin, we have to actually go to nearly the middle of his life. And what would blow Tobin's depraved sexual rampage wide open. So we go to the murder of Angelica Kluk. So Angelica was a 23-year-old student, and she was working as a cleaner to pay for her university studies. And while working in the church, she bumped into a man who was calling himself Pat McLaughlin, aka Peter Tobin. Now, Tobin would use different aliases because he was on the violent sex offenders register. So he would use at least up to 40 different names, the police think, to avoid detection so he could get work, and the people that he was working for and with didn't know what and who he really was. And unfortunately for Angelica, that it just went horribly wrong. So Angelica was last seen on the 24th of September 2006. I think it was her boyfriend that reported her missing. The police searched the church. They searched many areas around Glasgow where the St Patrick's Church, I'm sure it was. The police find out that the last person to see Angelica was handyman Pat McLaughlin, aka Peter Tobin. He'd fled by now, but before he did, he'd done something pretty disgusting, pretty bloody disgusting. So what actually happened to Angelica was, as she was cleaning, Tobin came up behind her, hit her in the head with what's thought to be a table leg. He dragged her into the garage of the church, where he proceeded to rape her. Then he stabbed her multiple times. Then he removed floorboards from the confessional area of the church, and while she was still alive, he stuffed her and then covered her up, and then went on to cook for the soup kitchen, the homeless soup kitchen that was happening that night at the church. So while people were in the church working and folk were coming in to get food, Angelica lay raped, stabbed, bleeding to death under their feet. Absolutely vile, disgusting man. And I've got some interviews from the police where they said this is one of the most horrific murders they've ever seen.
It's one of the most horrific murders I have ever seen in my 32 years in the police. It was horrendous. and I couldn't visualise how someone could have committed such an act against such an innocent, attractive young female.
It's definitely one of the worst cases I've dealt with, one of the most brutal.
Now, somebody that worked alongside Tobin at the church also gave an interview of how calm, collected Tobin was after he committed this murder.
Monday, September the 24th, 2006, he took his opportunity to strike. Tobin hit her with a table leg, knocking her to the ground. He then bound, gagged, raped, and stabbed her. After he had finished with Angelica, he wrapped her body in plastic bags, took her from the murder scene in the garage, and slid her into a small void under the church floor. He then went back to his business, preparing for the loaves and fishes Sunday supper.
That body, that young girl was underneath us. And he was there. He didn't disappear. He was there. He was with us.
The next day, Angelica was reported missing to Strathclyde police. They searched the church and its grounds. They interviewed a calm and controlled McLaughlin, who had spent the day erecting a shed in the church grounds, even though traces of Angelica's blood were spattered on the shed.
Well, I met him on Monday night and he was okay. Neither up nor down. Just the way he's always been. When I dropped him off, he'd mentioned, "Oh, the police are coming. A wee lassie's disappeared." And that was it. That was it. There was no fear, there was nothing.
So now the police are now searching for Angelica. Tobin flees, and a nationwide bulletin on the news goes out in search for him. But at this point, they assume his name is Pat McLaughlin. They don't know at this point his name is Peter Tobin.
It went nationwide at 6 o'clock at night.
Police looking for a missing Polish student have released a photo of the man who's the last person to see her before her disappearance. Pat McLaughlin, who's in his late 50s, saw 23-year-old Angelica Kluk on Sunday.
The publicity worked. A young woman recognised the face, but not the name.
So one of Tobin's old neighbours, she recognised the picture, but not the name. So she called them up and says, "The picture that you're showing isn't of Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin." So the police now knew who he really was, and the search went on for him.
He left the church and he went to Edinburgh, and then he travelled down south and checked into a hospital in London in a false name.
He had signed himself in as James Kelly.
One of the nursing staff recognised the person that had booked in a false name, recognised him as the Peter Tobin that was wanted for interview in relation to the murder of Angelica Kluk.
At 9 p.m. on the Friday, Angelica's body had finally been discovered by police, hidden in the small void underneath the floor of the church.
So when the police found Angelica's body, they also found semen and DNA on her. They put it into the national database and it came back as a match for Peter Tobin. And with that, they arrested him. So, just like all cowards and scumbags that commit these kind of crimes, Tobin denied it, which the police then had to go back to the beginning of Tobin's life and create a profile on him, and to figure out, had he done this before? He was now in his 50s, nearly 60s, and most killers of this and who commit crimes of this magnitude, they don't just start in their 60s.
The difficulty about dealing with somebody like Peter Tobin is he's an iterant, a geographically mobile serial offender. In other words, he crosses from one police force boundary area into another.
To date, In the whole of his life, we have established that he probably has used as many as 40 different aliases. And that's combinations of his own names, other people's names, people that he knew. This individual had access to in excess of 30 mobile phones within a year, within 2005, 2006. This was an individual that had something to hide.
So to find out how many vicious crimes Tobin was hiding, the police started Operation Anagram, where they went back into Tobin's life, where he stayed, what he did, and checked against databases of missing people in those areas. And they found something, and unfortunately they found something in the town I used to live in. So at this point we're going to go back to Peter Tobin's life, because we have to go back to find out what he did up until what happened to Angelica. So on the 27th of August 1946, Peter Tobin came into this world. As a young man, he offended multiple times, and by the age of 20 he'd been in and out of young offenders all of his life. So now we get to 1968, and Peter Tobin is living in a Shettlestone area of Glasgow. He was known as a charmer, but a bit of a loner, and he enjoyed going out. He was known as quite a snappy dresser, and he liked going to the discos and dances, and that's where he would meet his first victim, Margaret.
He came across as a very smart, a very knowledgeable, quite handsome guy. I don't think anybody would have turned him down as a dance partner. So yes, I was quite delighted when he came across him, and his pal asked myself and my pal to have a dance. Used to pick me up of a Saturday night, used to have me home dead on 10:30 when my parents would ask me to be home then.
Now, unfortunately for Margaret, this blissful relationship wouldn't last long. She was about to meet the real Peter Tobin, the angry, sexually depraved Peter Tobin.
He asked me if I would like to stay over, and I said, well, not this time, I need to ask my mum. I went to open the door and he just slammed the door and said, no, you're not going out.
Tobin had switched. He turned his flat into Margaret's prison. He was her jailer. She wasn't allowed any friends. He wouldn't let her see her parents. He kept her locked up to satisfy his depraved demands.
He wanted sex. I didn't feel in the mood for sex. So he just said, you're effing having sex, and pushed me on the bed, and he just took out this serrated knife and just put it right inside me and twisted it round after he'd had the sex.
Now, luckily for Margaret, one of the neighbours actually heard her and called an ambulance and managed to get her to hospital to save her life. But the worst thing that happened about all of this is the fact that at the time, 17-year-old Margaret, she was released back into the clutches, back into the custody of Peter Tobin, back into the hands of the man that just raped and tried to kill her.
She was discharged from hospital back into the hands of Tobin, too frightened to tell people that he had raped and attempted to murder her. Her nightmare continued as Tobin took her to live in Brighton, hundreds of miles away from friends and family. When Tobin told the 17-year-old they were getting married, she felt there was no way out.
We eventually got a flat in Brighton, and every time he would go out, he would lock me in a room.
Margaret and Tobin stayed in Brighton until he was yet again arrested for petty theft. They were taken back to Glasgow for questioning and spent the night in the cells.
And eventually it was my mother that came and took me out, and that was the first time I'd seen my mother in just under a year.
So Margaret was finally free. She divorced Tobin and never heard from him again. But Tobin, he ended up back in prison a further 2 times, and after he was released the second time, he met a nurse who he then married and had 2 children with. One of the children unfortunately died, but the violence in that relationship was horrendous. She eventually left as well and took her child with her, leaving Tobin on the prowl yet again. And this is when Tobin meets 16-year-old Kathy Wilson. Now, one thing about Tobin that I have noticed, he always seems to go for really, really young girls. I would say he's a bit of a groomer. But, so yeah, he meets Kathy Wilson. She's only 16. She's been in foster care. She was living with her gran, and she was on the street. Unfortunately, she was a vulnerable teenager and fell for Tobin's charm, and unfortunately ended up moving in with him.
Charming and quite funny, and just seemed like a genuinely nice bloke. We were getting on quite well and had started seeing each other, and he said, "Why don't you move in?" I don't know how he does it, but he knows. He must have something written on my head, and all these other women that he has hurt must have it as well. He must see something that other people don't see. But even though I appear very strong and confident now, there's like a little child inside, looking for someone to look after them and care for them, and that's what he provides. That's what he provides. And he knows it, and how he finds them, I don't know, but he knows it.
So after a few months, Tobin is about 40 at this time, remember. Kathy ends up getting pregnant, and she has a little boy, and they name their son Daniel. Tobin convinces her to marry him, and then convinces her to move from Brighton up to where I lived at the time, Bathgate in Scotland. So Tobin and Kathy moved to Robertson Way in Bathgate. Bathgate's a tiny little village in Scotland. It's the kind of place, kind of town where everybody knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's business. Kind of like a proper busybody little town. Not sad to have left it at all. But anyway, so Tobin takes Kathy and they move to Robertson Way. And unfortunately, the beatings and the assaults, they still continue and just get even more deranged and depraved.
From my point of view, I've gone through so many atrocities when I was a child that actually someone throwing you up against a wall and putting their hammer around your neck and calling you horrible names isn't that bad. Bizarrely, it's not. So, I part with things that you wouldn't normally part with and justify them. Say he's tired or he's had a bad day or something. You justify an awful lot of things when it's not as awful as other people might perceive it to be. I really think I was just a possession, and I think the anger from him was that the possession was not conforming the way it was meant to conform. That's all it was. I don't think there was any love there at all. He probably loved his son, I think.
So after a few years of living in Bathgate, Kathy finally gets the courage to escape Tobin. And after he leaves the house one day, she manages to get a friend to take her to a bus station in Glasgow, and then she manages to get a bus down to Portsmouth, where she met her family at the other end. And finally, she was free of this bloody monster. But the story doesn't end there in Bathgate, unfortunately. Now, going back to Kathy grew up not knowing her own father, and she didn't want that for her son Daniel. Even though Tobin was a horrible monster to her, she did say that he was a good father to Daniel. So she wanted Daniel to have his father in his life. She said that Peter Tobin doted on Daniel, so yeah, she allowed that to happen, and she felt that even though he was a vicious monster to her, he would never hurt their son. So for Peter to see his son, he would have to commute 8 hours from Bathgate to Portsmouth and then back again. And he felt that was too much. So he decided to move from Bathgate. But as I said, the story didn't end there in Bathgate. And I'm going to tell you about that now. And what I remember of this as a child that grew up in this area when this happened. So on February in 1991, a 15-year-old teenager from a place called Falkirk had actually been to see her sister in Livingston. Now, to get to Falkirk, from Livingston, she had to get a bus from Livingston to Bathgate, then from Bathgate to Falkirk. So she gets off the bus at Bathgate, and she's last seen eating fish and chips at a bus stop. Then she's never seen again. Her name was Vicky Hamilton, and I remember when this happened, the police were all over the town. I was very young, just a pre-teen at this time, and the police were searching everywhere for this girl, everywhere. Her pictures were up all over the town. The police were asking everyone if they'd seen her. They were searching people's homes, and no one knew what had happened to her. And it took literally years and years and years to figure out what finally happened to Vicky Hamilton. And unfortunately, the ending wasn't good. Unfortunately, she had bumped into the monster that is Peter Tobin.
With one of Scotland's most famous and longest running missing persons cases. In February 1991, a bright, vivacious teenager from Falkirk disappeared on her way home from her sister's house in Livingston. Vicky Hamilton had to change buses in Bathgate to get home to her mother's. She was last seen in the town eating fish and chips and waiting for a bus home. Vicky's disappearance triggered Scotland's biggest ever search for a missing person. Lothian and Borders police interviewed nearly 7,000 people and took over 3,000 statements. A massive search in and around Bathgate involving hundreds of people revealed nothing. Vicky's mum recorded an emotional plea.
Please get in contact. Let the police know that she's safe. That's all I want, just to know that she's safe.
It wasn't until nearly 17 years later that the mystery surrounding Vicky's disappearance started to unfold.
I can't tell you how absolutely frightening it is to know that you lived in the same tiny little town and probably seen this man as a serial killer, and that he had taken someone from our town, killed her, and it took 17 years to figure out what happened to this girl. Unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And to hear Vicky's mum's plea, I remember that. Even as a child on the news, her family playing on the TV, it was absolutely heartbreaking, and it just goes to show that you don't ever really know who's living in your town, do you? You don't really know what depraved individuals really live in the place you stay. So be vigilant of your surrounding area, and yeah, because to know that you're living in the same town as a bloody serial killer, it just beggars belief. But let's carry on. So when the police realised that we had this serious sex offender living in our area, Peter Tobin, they thought he warranted a little bit more of an investigation. By this time he'd fled, he'd moved back down to England, but they decided to search the house where he stayed. And in the loft of that house, hidden in the walls, they found a knife. And unfortunately on that knife they found some human skin. And the DNA came back and it was Vicky Hamilton's.
One of the officers went out in an inquiry and we established that Peter Tobin resided in Robertson Avenue in Bathgate, which was close to where Vicky Hamilton was last seen.
And to have someone of that character living in your area is obviously worthy of further investigation.
A forensic search of the house revealed a knife hidden in the loft.
Discovered on the knife was a piece of material which was thought to be skin and yielded a DNA profile which matched perfectly the profile of Vicky Hamilton.
Lothian and Borders police knew Vicky had been in Tobin's house and that he had probably murdered her, but they didn't have a body.
So as I says, it took 17 years for them to figure out what happened to Vicky Hamilton. But before they figured that out, Peter had moved down to England from Bathgate. And on this occasion, yeah, he done something absolutely vile. If he can even get even more depraved than he already is, he just gets worse. Honestly, when you hear what he's did to Vicky's, it just gets worse. So I'm just warning you. So Peter, as I said, moves from Scotland to England so he can see his son Daniel. And he uses Daniel as a pawn to lure young teenage girls round to babysit. And one night, he has 2 young teenage girls round to babysit, and he plies them with alcohol and drugs their drink. When they're... Bear in mind, his son, his 5-year-old son, is in the house at this time. He then calls his son's mum, Kathy, to come and pick up his son, saying that he thinks there's something going on with his heart. So Kathy comes and she picks up Daniel. She doesn't know, obviously, what is going on inside that house. So when Peter returns to the house, he then rapes and sodomizes these 2 girls. He stabs one of them. He then turns the gas on and walks out of the house. I think that he was hoping that one would succumb to her stab wound and die, and then the gas would finish them off. But it didn't, and thankfully, these 2 girls were going to be okay. They were traumatised, obviously very traumatised, but he hadn't. Even though he tried, he hadn't killed them.
To have young women round to babysit. His normal routine was to leave the babysitters with Daniel and then go out for the night. But on the evening of August the 4th, 1993, Tobin carefully planned a vicious trap for 2 young girls. He tried to turn on the charm to seduce the 2 teenagers. When this failed, he plied them with alcohol and finally he drugged them. As it started to take effect, he began his horrendous assault. In the middle of the night, Tobin telephoned Kathy to come to collect Daniel, telling her that he was feeling seriously unwell with heart trouble. When she arrived, Tobin was coming out of the door with Daniel.
So I took Daniel from him at the front door and I said, do you want me to wait for the ambulance to arrive? You know, you okay? He said, no, I don't feel quite so bad now, but still take him because I think I will go and be checked, have a check-up. I put my son in the car and we came home and went to bed.
With Daniel finally out of the way, Tobin toyed with the girls. He threatened them with a knife, and as the drink and drugs overwhelmed the girls, they could no longer defend themselves. He brutally raped and sodomized them. Then, as they lay unconscious, he turned on the gas taps and left them for dead.
I have no doubt that he expected those 2 girls to die, and the fact that they didn't was an accident.
So thankfully these 2 girls survived and they went to the police. The police then contacted Kathy and asked her to collect her son and come to see them. Tobin then fled and hid out for a couple of weeks before I think he was caught.
This morning I took my son to school, went to work, and then had a phone call at 9:30 from the police. And they said, we need to get your son out of school and we need you to come to the police station now and see us and bring someone with you. So that's what I did. And I arrived at the police station and they told me what atrocities had gone on the night before in the flat. And that was the first I heard.
In fact, 5-year-old Daniel had been witness to part of the brutal attacks of the previous night.
At one point, where Peter had stabbed one of the girls and there was blood, he asked Daniel to go and get ice from the freezer and bring it through to him and put it onto the girl.
Now, what Tobin did to these girls is absolutely horrible. But to involve your 5-year-old son, sees you stabbing a girl, and then you ask him to go and get ice from the freezer. Unbelievable. I would have stopped my child from seeing that lunatic there and then. But that's just me. And as I said, Kathy had been brainwashed for so long by Tobin. She's a victim in all this, as well as their son Daniel. It's absolutely heartbreaking that this little boy had to see this. And I feel so bad for Kathy. I really do feel horrible for her.
So far, police have no positive leads in their search for Mr. Tobin. They're keeping a check on addresses in the Midlothian area of Scotland where he used to live. Yesterday, they took the unusual step of naming Mr. Tobin as the man they want to question in connection with the alleged attacks.
So Tobin was finally caught when his car was spotted in Brighton. He pled guilty to rape, but he took a plea deal, so he wasn't charged with the attempted murder. And for this, he got a grand total of, 14 years. And you only do about 2/3 of that in the UK, so he was probably out within about 7-8. So as I said, Tobin, he didn't do all of his time. In 2004, he got out. And do you think he'd maybe changed? Do you think he'd maybe saw the error of his ways? Nah, not Tobin. Not this serial, prolific sex offender who enjoys torturing women. Just a disgusting, vile man.
He found himself a new flat where in 2005 he began to groom another young woman.
When I seen Peter Tobin round about the town, and I'd speak to him all the time, he asked me to go for a pint one day, and I went for a pint. And I was continually talk to him. And then one day he says, "You want to come round to my flat for a coffee?" I went round, and it was a Saturday because the football results were on. And then I was got up to leave, and he jumped at my throat with a knife and told me to lie down.
Cheryl McLaughlin had been in the army and was brought up with 8 boys. She was used to fighting her corner.
I managed to get the knife off him, and then I cut my horn open, and then I ran to go to try and get in the keys fell out. And then I turned round and he was chasing me down the hall again with it. So I managed to shout and scream, "Get knife down, get knife down." They threw it in the kitchen sink, and then in the living room, kid was taking a heart attack.
Now I'm probably going to have to translate what this lady said, because she's Glaswegian and she's got a very strong Scottish accent. So what she said is she met Peter in the town, and he asked her if she would like to go out for a beer with him. She said yes and befriended him. Then she went round to his apartment and she got up to leave, and he attacked her with a knife. She then fought him, managed to get the knife off him, but it cut her hand open. And as the struggle ensued, the knife, I think, ended up in the sink, and Peter pretended he was taking a heart attack. So he turned it round to to make out that he was the victim. Bloody unbelievable, this man. But this young woman as well was also in the army and had brothers, and she knew how to defend herself. So she was lucky in that respect, and good on her for standing up to him and fighting back, because if she hadn't, he probably would have killed her. So this young lady, Cheryl, she went to the police, and when the police went to arrest Peter the next day, he was gone. He was in the wind, and they couldn't find him for 7 months. And then 7 months later he appeared, and he had changed his name to Pat McLaughlin and was now working at the church. And here we are back at the murder of Angelica Kluk.
Operation Anagram, the police unit devoted to uncovering Tobin's criminal past, has since attempted to piece together Tobin's movements as he evaded the police after the attack in 2005. They know that over the next few months he stayed in a number of hostels. 7 months after the attack on Cheryl, Tobin was now calling himself Pat McLaughlin and began working as a handyman in St Patrick's Church. The place which was the scene of the murder that at long last brought him to the nation's attention, and where Operation Anagram would begin their difficult investigation.
So when Tobin was arrested for the murder of Angelica Kluk, he said he was innocent, like they all do. The police obviously had to build their case, gather evidence, and they also wanted to know, was this his first victim? Because he's in his late 50s at this point, and normally crimes of this magnitude by people, they tend to not start at this late an age. So the police suspected that Tobin had done this before, especially because of how calculated and how cool and collected he was after the murder of Angelica.
On his watch we found microscopic traces of blood associated with the strap and the sort of grooves and crevices in the strap, and that blood matched the profile of Angelica Kluk. Also, he had on a white t-shirt which was stained at the front, and that was his semen, and a lot of cells matching Angelica Kluk.
So Operation Anagram looked into all the places that Tobin had lived and against missing females in those areas, and they linked him with two people, Vicky Hamilton and another victim. But of course, the wily coward and pathetic, scumbag that he is, he denied everything, didn't he?
Knew Vicky had been in Tobin's house and that he had probably murdered her, but they didn't have a body. Already in custody for the murder of Angelica, Tobin was then charged with Vicky's abduction. There was not enough evidence for a murder charge. What they needed was a confession.
We seemed to be in control most of the time. However, he declined to speak about Vicky Hamilton other than to deny any knowledge of her.
Sorry, I can't help you. You know what I mean? As I say, I've never met her. You know what I mean? I've never.
While the police in Scotland had been following up the leads in the Vicky Hamilton case from the Operation Anagram, Essex police force 400 miles away had been trying to find another missing girl.
So just 6 months after Vicky had went missing, 18-year-old Dinah McNichol also went missing, and she had went to a music festival with friends, and she was last seen hitchhiking, and a description of the car and the man of whom she'd taken the lift off was given to police. They said it was a Scottish man and gave a description of Peter Tobin's car, but of course the police didn't know that at the time.
With Dinah missing for more than 5 months, police fear she's either dead or has been persuaded to join a religious sect and is being held against her will.
Following Tobin's steps, Operation Anagram managed to trace back credit card receipts of Dinah's that were used in at the same time that Tobin was in these areas that he lived. So it gave the police somewhere to start.
The whodunit for us. So Tobin, whilst on the radar, it wasn't until we really analysed a lot of the data that Strathclyde in particular had, then he really came up the scale and became somebody of primary interest to us investigating Dinah's disappearance.
He rose even higher on that scale when Essex police studied the use of Dinah's credit card in several towns along the south coast.
We were able to show that Tobin had links to areas very close to each of these cash machines, either friends or previous residents or places of work. So that was all part of the formula that led us down to Margate in the first place.
And this is what led the police to Margate, to one of Tobin's houses where he stayed just after Vicky went missing and just after Dinah went missing. So they decided to go and speak to Tobin's old neighbours to see if they had any information that they could give them.
Saw him digging a deep hole, and I leaned over the fence, which was a lot shorter at that time, and I said, "Are you going for Australia, Pete?" Because it seemed quite big, and he told me he was digging a sandpit for the little one at the weekends.
Peter Tobin, we now know, was somebody who was profiled as somebody who could well have committed this type of offence. We could show through the analytical work that he probably had opportunity, and I think what we knew from Angelica Kluk investigation was that he had a propensity to bury bodies.
So knowing this information, the police managed to get a court to give a search warrant to search the garden of Peter Tobin's old home in Margate. And what they find in the garden is absolutely, it's horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. So the sandpit, where his neighbour said that he's seen him digging a really deep hole, and he said it was for his son. The police started there and they went and got X-ray kind of equipment so they could have a look to see if there was anything buried in the ground, and they saw something. When they began to dig, they found a body, and it was unfortunately Vicky Hamilton's. The way he had disposed of her is horrifying. He'd actually cut her body up. He had done it with so much precision that the police said that he's either a very lucky man to be able to do this so meticulously his first time, or he's did this before. They then went and searched more of the garden, and they got to the end of the garden and started digging there. And in that part of the garden, wrapped in bags, was Dinah McNichol. She hadn't been dismembered like Vicky had. Luckily though, Tobin had wrapped Vicky's body parts and Dinah's in so much plastic bags that it actually preserved evidence. So his DNA, fingerprints, even down to the cause of death was still able to be established on how he killed these two girls. It said that he drugged Vicky, then stabbed her, then dismembered her while in Bathgate. Then he took her body, drove 8 hours from Scotland to England with her body, and then buried it in his garden. And only a few months later, that's when he's taken Dinah and raped and killed her as well. He also raped Vicky. So the police, that's 3 bodies now, 3 murders that this guy's committed, but the police are thinking he's definitely done more. Obviously, he's been charged with rape and that in the past and attempted murder, although he got off with that. Normally serial killers don't start in their 50s. And the depravity and calmness and how cool he was around just around the police with these murders makes the police think that he's done this, he's murdered way more people, but unfortunately they've not found the bodies and they can't prove it, and Tobin will never ever admit to anything in his life. He's just a disgusting piece of shit.
The body and the personal effects have been identified as Vicky Hamilton, who went missing in February 1991 from Bathgate in Scotland.
It was a massive shock for Essex police. They'd only been looking for Dinah's body. They certainly never thought that Tobin would have driven a dismembered corpse nearly 500 miles to bury Vicky in his back garden. Vicky's body had been cut in two. Tobin then carefully wrapped it in plastic. This helped to preserve some evidence, so when the autopsy was carried out, they found that Vicky had been drugged and then strangled.
There has been a significant discovery within the last couple of hours here at 50 Irvine Drive. There has been another body discovered.
The body was quickly confirmed as Dinah's. It had been wrapped in a number of plastic bags. The 16-year search had finally come to an end, but police then had to sift through the evidence as they prepared to charge Tobin.
So by the time Vicky and Dinah's bodies were found, Tobin was already serving a 21-year prison sentence in Peterhead prison in Scotland. But then he was also charged with the murder of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. And the police suspect that Tobin has committed way more murders than he's been tried for, because, as I said, normally serial killers don't just start killing when they're in their late 50s. So police have been looking back at cases to see if they can link Tobin to anything, and as of yet, I don't know if they've managed to do that, if they've found any bodies, or if Tobin's admitted to anything. I doubt that he has, because he's a scumbag. He'll never admit to anything. But it's absolutely heartbreaking that these three girls lost their life to such a vicious monster. And there's a special place in hell waiting for the likes of Peter Tobin. So my thoughts are with the family of Angelica, Vicky and Dinah. And thank you so much for watching. Bye guys.